welcome to Journeys and Journals. I'm Bernie Martin Beck, and I get to take you on trips that explore the West. We're going my guest is Fred Dayton, who's traveled the Oregon Trail. From where have you traveled? I mean, if you were to map what part of the trail you've been on.
We have been on most all of it that is accessible by automobile. There are a lot of it, of course, there isn't a paved road near, but we have paralleled it, not all in one trip. We have been in St. Joseph, where a lot of the people started. We have traveled, of course, across Kansas and Nebraska. This past spring, we'd made a trip to Texas, and on the way back, we had an opportunity to spend quite a bit of time in Wyoming and see those sections of it. We've seen most of it in Oregon, particularly around Baker City, where we have the Interpretive Center.
And would you recommend to everybody make a trip?
If you have not yet been to Baker City and the Interpretive Center and the related Oregon history around there, you don't have a real understanding of the state you live in.
And people come from all around the world to see this. Look, in this book he's brought are actual tracks. You've seen them with your own eye.
Oh, yes. And if you go to the Interpretive Center at Baker City, you will see them with your own eyes, because you look out to the southwest and there are these tracks across the prairie where the wagons traveled.
Now, why? Why are there tracks like this?
Because the wagons were heavy and they compressed the soil. And although grass is growing in it, as you see there, that grass grows different because that soil is compacted. And although it's a 150-year-old compaction, unless there's been a plow in that ground, that will be visible.
150 years ago, somebody started from St. Joseph,
or Independence, Missouri, and they started out in search of a new life.
And this wagon was like an ark, or, I mean, that's all they had, right?
Yes. What you had in that wagon and the livestock you had with you were your possessions. That and hopefully some money.
Ah, some money for...
Well, let's take a look at our map here.
Okay.
Now, you can't carry enough in your wagon to get all the way from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City.
Not enough carrots, not enough.
No, well, beans and flour. I don't think there was much in the way of fresh vegetables at all. But there were a few places along the route that you could buy commodities. Fort Bridger, Fort Hall, and there is a reproduction of the fort at Fort Hall now, really neat to see. But in 1863, when Fort Hall was in its heydays, and you were coming in this wagon, and you needed flour, it was $1.50 a pound in Fort Hall.
And in St. Louis, it cost you?
Nickel, 3 cents maybe.
So it's kind of like a Speedy Mart that costs more than going downtown to the supermarket.
Well, you know, Fort Hall's out in the middle of nowhere. The flour has to be transported in there.
From one end or the other.
A lot of it came up the Columbia River and was brought into Fort Hall because the gold mines up in Montana were being especially productive. The most productive placers ever in the United States were in Alder Gulch in Virginia City, Montana. They needed supplies. So when you arrive in your wagon, you are competing with the miner to buy that flour,
Who had bags of gold.
who had bags of gold. So,
And you may have sold almost everything you had to get the wagon together and to, what all, I mean, did they really bring stoves?
yes, they really did, and there was a time when they could be found on the trail where they had been abandoned because the weight was too great for the animals to keep pulling them.
I mean, something so basic as a stove. Just,
Now, Bernie, you cook. Would you rather cook on this or in a fireplace? Now, when you get to the Willamette Valley, how are you going to buy a new stove? Because for that stove to have been there, it would have had to have come from somewhere and then up the Columbia River to Portland,
it would have probably come around the
around the Horn.
South America.
So this stove, which cost $12 in Missouri, could easily cost $150 in Oregon.
That's an awful lot of gold.
That's a lot of gold.
What about this box of matches?
Do you know what they called a kitchen match like that at that time? They were called a lucifer
Because they illuminated things?
because they were aflame. Because first time I read the reference to a lucifer, I thought, that's weird. But that was the original name for that kind of match. Now those you could carry a fair quantity of. And these had a good shelf life.
Ziploc bags hadn't been invented, not even.
Just not even thought of.
So they had to be kept, because you're talking about fording a river. And what happened to some of the things in the wagons?
You were far more concerned on keeping your flour dry than many of your other things in the wagon. If you had garments, they could be hung out to dry. But if you had foodstuffs, they would be destroyed by the dampness. Your matches would be destroyed.
You bet. Well, here's the little lady. She does have a wooden bucket.
She does.
Would they have brought a bucket? They would.
There would have been a bucket hanging on the side of the wagon, because when you got to the place where the water was, and you had to fill the barrel that was on the side of the wagon, you had to have something to get the water out of the stream up into into the barrel.
And it would have been a wooden bucket like this.
Absolutely.
The picture in here was just very, very educational. Water for what? Did they take frequent baths?
No, they took very infrequent baths. Hygiene as we know it was non-existent. If you bathed, it was because you came on a stream. The water was first drinking water, then cooking water, livestock water.
And then bathing water.
Well,
way down the
list. Yes. We discussed earlier some things about the diaries and the fact that the women kept most of the diaries that existed on the Oregon Trail.
Because
Many more of the women were literate, and they would take the time. It was much more important to them to record what was going on than the man who was keeping the livestock moving, perhaps hunting. And on top of that, the literacy rate among the women was so much higher. But, think about the type of food stuff that you could transport with no concept of refrigeration. Everything would have had to have been dried. So in order to consume it, you'd have to put some moisture into it.
what? No canned goods?
No can.
There probably were tin boxes and tin.
There were some, yes, and that's probably what your flour, the flour that you were using probably would have been in something like that, as opposed to the unopened bags of flour.
because they had already thought about wet. I mean, these stories traveled back, whether it was the Applegates telling the wild stories of their excursions.
Yes.
They went back, wrote books or told stories. And
The Applegates, of course, created the Applegate Trail. And we believe that the reason they set up the Applegate Trail was to avoid the boat trip on the Columbia River because several of the family members were drowned. And because the Applegate Trail was very difficult. And it is a section of the Oregon Trail. It would be really the Applegate cutoff.
And there were other cutoffs right here that took you into.
There's one here called Sublet's Cutoff, because if you look at the map, Fort Bridger is so far out of the way to the south, you're adding lots of miles to your trip. So you take one or the other of these cutoffs unless you absolutely have to have supplies. You ever been to Fort Bridger?
No.
You got to get there. When you go to Baker City, just keep on going, and you go on over to Wyoming and see Fort Bridger. It's well worth the trip. On the way, you can stop by Fort Hall.
Okay. I've been to, I guess, Oregon City's about the only place I've actually been on this
They have
trail.
a great interpretive center. And that, of course, was the ultimate destination. But we have great admiration for the people who undertook this trip and were willing to bring civilization to the West Coast to start tying the United States together.
Well, they brought education along with them. That's something I'm really excited about.
Absolutely.
And they had one book that for sure got on every wagon, I'm told.
Oh, yes. The family Bible, I believe you are alluding to, is the book that often has all of the births and deaths and the genealogy. If they can get their hands on that book from that family, can reconstruct so much. But yes, that was the book that was kept under any circumstances.
And you taught reading out of it. You taught. It was picture books. It was everything.
It was.
Yeah. Now you have traveled in spurts. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
You and your wife, Bertie.
Yes.
She has a love for pioneer things too.
She's fascinated by these things, even though she's an East Coast girl.
Sitting out of this show.
We find these things intriguing. One of the great parts about pursuing these travels is you end up on the back roads and you end up in the little towns. And that's where you meet the interesting people. You go, almost every little town has a museum. And you go into the museum and you look for the books that were written by the locals. And lots of them are very amateurish. But they tell the story of the people who settled that area and what they did to prosper and stay alive.
Now, is it true that there were dogs brought on the Oregon Trail?
Oh, certainly. Many, well, when you left Missouri, you didn't leave your pet dog.
And there he is, and this is just almost desolate. But there's water. And water was so important.
That's right. So much of this area is plains. And the thing that was fascinating when we were in Wyoming this past May is it was a flood. They were having these heavy, heavy rains. Although we didn't get trapped in the rains, we could see the result of it in the green grass. If we had been bringing a wagon pulled by oxen, they'd have had plenty of feed. However, getting across the Platte River would have been a challenge.
Because that flood stage, it's impossible.
You would not enter into that river in your wagon and hope to cross it. It was just too high. The current was too swift you'd never been able to contain it.
So anytime you see a river rushing, think about the chances of fording it.
Extraordinarily difficult. And how long do you wait for the river to drop so that you can make that trip? Because you have got deadlines and other places, because when you get into the mountains in Oregon, you got to get through before the snow hits.
Because it came through where? Where did it come across? Close to Mount Hood?
They went to the Dalles.
Right.
And in the Dalles, they gave up their wagons and took boats and came on down. And then the Barlow Cutoff, which went around the south side of Mount Hood, was built. But the Barlow Cutoff was a very difficult road to maintain because it was in such heavy timber that every winter the trees fell, and we look at the trees and go, wow, there's value, bring out my chainsaw. But when you had to cut them with a handsaw and an axe, getting them out of your road and reconstructing that road every spring was a real challenge.
You just mentioned handsaw and axe. Those had to be on wagons, didn't they?
Absolutely, along with your shovel.
Okay, just name 10 things you'd want to be sure. I already said matches.
Sure.
And now you've got shovel, axe.
You've got a variety of tools. You're going to have, within the wagon train, somebody's going to have to be some semblance of a blacksmith, because horseshoes are going to have to be maintained. Boy, is this some kind of a test? I have never really sat down. Have you ever seen a wagon grinder? I've got the slickest. What they did is they screwed them onto the outside of the wagon because they're mounted on wood, and they're a coffee grinder. Because remember, the coffee you were carrying was beans, and this was your grinder for creating it. Coffee was very, very important. When they ran out of coffee, they were out of food. But the little things that we think about, what cooking utensils?
Yeah, you have to have something with a handle because it has to hang over the fire.
Mm-hmm. You're going to need some kind of a Dutch oven, because we know one of the major food stocks was beans because they're transportable. Well, beans have got to be soaked and cooked, and that takes a pretty good sized pot.
And a pretty lot fire too.
That's correct.
Well, I'm going to put one thing on my covered wagon. This happens to come from your friend, Robert Martin, my dad. It was out of his childhood. It's got straw for legs, and this is Jehoshaphat, and I thought maybe you'd like to meet him. His face is made from just squeezing together some of the...
It is a pleasure to meet Jehoshaphat, and you know what this doll tells me? It was loved. When you have a toy that is intact, it was cared for, and it was loved.
And our families have known one another since before any of us kids were born.
That's true. Yes, your father was instrumental in my father courting my mother. He managed to provide transport for my father to go to Los Angeles. And
See?
it was, there's some very interesting stories there. Our appreciation of history, I think, also involves our knowledge of the role that our families played in the community we live in here. Your father was the mayor for several years. My father was chairman of the Planning Commission for several years, on the Utility Commission. They were involved in the things that brought Grants Pass to the community that it became. Just like the people who came on the Oregon Trail or on the Applegate Trail brought to this area their concept of community. And the teaching, the Bible, as you referred to, as their fundamental teaching tool. All of this so significantly interrelates to who you and I are today.
Absolutely, pioneering. And our parents were involved in not just local things, but much broader. They had come here with little, with very, very little.
On the internet recently, there was a photograph alluding to how hard things can be. And that photograph was on the corner of 6th and G in 1929. Just said, hop pickers needed. And I couldn't believe it when one of the economic newsletters I subscribed to had that photo, because that was what my father saw when he got here, and he and his parents didn't have enough money to buy gasoline to keep moving. So he went out and worked in the hop fields, and that was the sign that caused him to have that job.
Ah, fantastic, Fred. I know that we came, both of us, from really tough times. And here we are, both with shoes and socks on. We're pretty lucky that our families came. We haven't even mentioned your sisters and your mother. They are pretty important to all of us.
Oh, absolutely. The sense of family. We lost my mother in July.
This year.
July this year, yes. It was very difficult. She had a stroke back at Thanksgiving and lost her communication skills. And the number of people who approached me and said, I am so lost. I can't pick up the phone and call Irvily and say, well, what was happening in Grants Pass at that time? Sometimes it takes that tragedy before we fully understand the role that some of our family members played in the community that we live in or we grew up in.
Well, it was the very first Josephine journals that Irvily sat here and told her story. On the 10th anniversary, she was my anniversary guest. On the 15th anniversary of this show, she was my guest, and that's the end of the story. She was a pioneer woman indeed, who came from LA with her fancy clothes and her gloves and her hat.
She kind of got dropped off the end of the earth, didn't she?
You think that, tell me about your present home. What have you learned about that community?
Well, Roseburg is a community that has significant challenges because Roseburg was a mill town and the environmental movement has cut off the accessibility of the timber. The letterhead for the city says timber capital of the nation. And we still have the trees. We just don't have cutting permits. In the absence of the cutting permits, we don't have the jobs. So the population is really quite static. The economic stability is that it changed from working, particularly timber related, to retirees who do have more stable income streams.
And of course, everyone thinks in terms, I mean, I do when I hear Roseburg, of the blast that killed so many, and that has been archived on public broadcasting. I mean, it's just a sad, sad story. How many blocks of Roseburg went up that night?
Oh, about 4 were demolished and probably another dozen significantly impacted. And what was hard to figure was there were places some distance away where houses were pushed up the foundation, various things that occurred. I don't know if I ever told you, but the night of the blast, my family with another family were going to Portland. And we stopped at the Umpqua Hotel and had dinner. And on the way out of town at 9 o'clock, stopped at this little ice cream store and got some chewing gum. 3 days later, when we came back through, where that little ice cream store had been was a sheared off slab. Nothing was there. No plumbing sticking up. A little bit of the VA tile was still there. So yes, the blast was tremendous. The Roseburg, it'd take more time than I think we want to get into now, but I did spend 14 years on the Planning Commission and 8 years as chairman, so I do have quite a bit of knowledge.
Well,
of
then
it.
I invite you back. What you started out telling me about your interest in Eastern Oregon. You've covered a little of Southern Oregon and the mines up in these places, and now what next for you? You still going to travel the Oregon Trail?
Probably pick up a little bit of it. I have not, I've been on both ends of the Santa Fe Trail, picked up parts of it, but I feel like I need to travel the Santa Fe Trail to fill in some of the gaps. Now, the Santa Fe Trail is a totally different thing because the Oregon Trail was pioneers moving here to live. The Santa Fe Trail was commerce, moving from Missouri to Santa Fe because Santa Fe was a gathering point, and they conducted trades of goods for silver, gold, whatever was of value in Santa Fe. That's a whole different story, but it's equally fascinating in the development of the western United States.
Well, this is really a road that I'm thrilled you've brought us on. The Oregon Trail.
I tell you what, Bernie, you go to Baker City and you look at the Interpretive Center and you go up to Sumter, which is 29 miles from Baker City, and you look at the dredge, and I'll come back and you and I'll discuss those things.
It's a deal. Thank you so much,
You
Freddie,
bet.
for being our guest on Journeys and Journals. And this has been quite the journey. The Traces.
Traces is a great name for that book.
Because they left traces coming on the Oregon Trail.
Right.
I'm Bernie Martin Beck. Thank you so much. I'll put my sunbonnet on and we'll just, they were made out of any leftover material. And the shoes wore out, but the sunbonnets survived.
That's correct.
Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.